Joining me today is New Hampshire State Representative Steve Smith. So, Steve, I want to touch base on some of the things that your committee sort of looked at, because there are a lot of interesting sort of things that went through the committee, and two of them, I think, one of them affects everybody in the state who travels by air, the Real ID program, and I want to touch a little bit on that, and the other is the sort of, I don't know if it affects a lot of places in Hillsborough, in Sullivan or Merrimack County, but certainly in the more metropolitan areas of the state, Uber and Lyft came before you. So let's start with Real ID.
Yeah, what a way to start too, because this was my first term as the chair of policy committee. So this was a very, very emotional bill. New Hampshire's history with Real ID, which was passed by the federal government in 2005, was to respond by passing a New Hampshire law that referred to the Real ID Act of 2005 as, and I quote, repugnant. That's in our statutes. And Real ID, the federal statute was, you have to have an ID that is certified. At the time, it was believed that there was going to be an actual federal ID card.
Okay.
And they established a set of criteria for what a verifiable ID was, and they did a terrible job of selling it and explaining it. And most people believe that you're all going to get federal IDs, and it evoked imagery like, if you're old enough, as I am, to have seen World War II movies, right, you must have your papers.
Yeah.
And it's un-American. And the sentiment was so strong that the bill declaring it repugnant and that we would never comply with it passed the Senate back then unanimously in 2006, passed the House almost unanimously. So it's not a partisan issue, and Governor Lynch took his own time to travel around to places telling everyone how awful the Real ID Act was. Having said that, everyone keeps talking about planes. Planes have almost nothing to do with it, though, because that was the deadline for compliance that was extended out the furthest. If you look at the Department of Homeland Security's website, they have had a phased implementation for federal facilities that I don't have any jurisdiction over. They're federal. And they have been implementing that. If you want to go to a military base, go to Washington, D.C. and tour the Mint or the Capitol building. Those are federally controlled facilities, and they are allowed to determine who gets in and with what ID. We have people being turned away from some of those facilities.
Show me your New Hampshire driver's license.
Yes.
Sorry, it doesn't comply.
Correct. And
you're out of the tour?
Right. And so we realized this was going on, and in July of last year, we contacted Department of Homeland Security, and the deputy director and his staff came here so that we could hammer out an agreement, because they told us, we're not extending your waiver any longer. There are only 4 states left in the entire country that have done nothing, New Hampshire among them. Turns out the first thing to do to get a waiver extended is you must have a plan for compliance. We got them to agree that if we would file a bill to do something, that would constitute a plan for compliance. So that took care of that. We also said, we understand about the federal facilities, but the impetus behind resisting it is very strong in New Hampshire, and we'd like our people to be able to continue to do that. You can make a non-Real ID license compliant by explicitly stating that it is not. So it'll have a disclaimer on the bottom, not valid for federal ID.
But if I wanted to use it for federal ID, my New Hampshire's driver's license, I could opt in, correct?
You can, yes. Yeah, and that begins next year. When you're up for, that was another thing too. We didn't want, it would be incredibly expensive to just redo every license and ID in the state at once. We got DHS to agree to do a phased rollout. It'll be when you renew. And in the meanwhile,
and then you just opt in, and then it's and you can use it to board through TSA as well.
Yes.
I mean, that's where I think most people were talking about it that I talked to.
Yes, and this was all compounded by the fact that, so we hammered this deal out in July. We began drafting the bill in July and had a pretty good idea what we were going to do. And you can imagine my surprise in August when I wake up one morning and find MUR, Union Leader, Concord Monitor, and everybody else reporting that New Hampshire IDs will not be good at airports in January of 2016. There were 6 people in the New Hampshire negotiating team in that room, and none of our phones rang before they went with that story. This is what happens with the big ones that don't actually do work, like you guys. They just take an AP feed and then they run with it. I would imagine that you would say, hey, Steve, what's going on with this, before you went with a story. Frustrating. To their credit, the Concord Monitor is the only one that printed a retraction.
Well, it certainly got a lot of attention, though, across the state.
So the 3 options: do nothing, and you'll get your non-compliant ID. Check a box, you get one that gets you into federal facilities. And for $30 extra, you get one that's good for Western Hemisphere border crossings. No passport to drive to Canada or Mexico.
And I imagine for the North Country, that's great.
It's huge, yeah, particularly for businesses that do a lot of border jumping.
Hey, we're out of time in this segment, but when we return, we're going to continue our conversation, so please stay with us.